Drivers make mistakes, pedestrians make mistakes, but just because you make a mistake on the road doesn't mean you deserve to die.
Wouldn't it be nicer if the streets were safer when he was alive?
The savings in lives, the savings in injuries is so dramatic that no other technology, I don't think, can get us there. What are we waiting for?
I'm Julie Rose, and this is Top of Mind. I have been a radio journalist for 2 decades, but a few years ago, I found myself avoiding the news for long stretches because of how depressing and divisive it all seems. I still wanted to be informed and engaged on important issues, though, and I figured I couldn't be alone in that. So we created this podcast. Each episode, we tackle one tough topic in a way that will challenge you, help you feel more empathy, and empower you to become a better citizen, a kinder neighbor, and a more effective advocate. Today, a rising tide of traffic deaths in America.
After we buried Asif, I wanted to visit the place where he was killed. And it was drizzling on that day. It was cloudy and drizzling. There were very few people on the sidewalk.
This is Lizzie Rahman.
And Asif Rahman, my son, he was killed on Queens Boulevard in 2008.
Queens Boulevard. It's a road in Queens, New York that's one of the busiest in the state. It's as wide as 200 feet in some places, often 12 lanes across. Rahman describes it
like a mini highway. People drove very fast.
Nicknamed the Boulevard of Death, 186 people have been killed on Queens Boulevard since the 1990s. At the time of his death in 2008, Asif Rahman was living with his family in Queens, and he'd recently gotten a job at a school across town.
He was working as a substitute, and that was the full-time position. And I was happy, but I was a little bit reluctant because of the distance. First day, he took the train to go there, and next day, he took his bicycle. After he came home, he was telling me that, Mom, I took the bicycle and it took me only 15 minutes to go there. And by train, it took almost an hour. But I was reluctant and I said as if it's dangerous. And he assured me. He told me, Mom, don't worry, there are bike lanes everywhere. So I thought maybe bike lanes are supposed to keep people safe and my son would be safe. So when I visited his crash site, and I noticed there were no bike lane on Queens Boulevard. And I just couldn't fathom it. I just uttered in front of my family, I have to get a bike lane. Because I felt like even though Asif wouldn't come back, but a lot of people will be safe and a lot of mothers, they will not go through this agony just like me.
America's roads are dangerous. Compared to other wealthy nations, traffic deaths per capita in the United States are more than double. And over the past couple of years, most of those countries have seen fewer vehicle deaths while we have had more. Over 40,000 Americans are killed on roads each year. That number is the highest it's been since the mid-2000s. And it's being driven by an increase in deaths among the most vulnerable road users, pedestrians, and cyclists. So today on Top of Mind, we're exploring why American roads are so exceptionally dangerous and how we might make them safer. Think of a chaotic street in the U.S. A big city like New York probably comes to mind, right? Crossing a road in Manhattan can certainly feel like taking your life into your hands. So it might surprise you to learn that the Big Apple is actually a national leader in street safety. Since 1990, traffic fatalities in the city have dropped nearly 40%. Much of that improvement has been spurred by activists like Lizzie Rahman, whose son Asif died in 2008.
He was into poetry, spoken word poetry, and then he was into rapping.
Style effects, Rex makes the rhymes, secret rhyme recipes, gain flavor with time. Increase the time to gain style effects till you get complex enough to perplex.
He was really talented. His final desire was to be a music teacher.
On the day he died, Asif had just clocked out at his new teaching job and hopped on his bike to head home.
He made a right turn on Queens Boulevard Just after a couple of blocks, there was a truck double parked. So he tried to go around the truck. And at that time, another truck, a freight truck, a bigger one, came and just hit him from the back. And he fell on the street. And the driver didn't stop and he just drove over him, crashing all his organs. I mean, he died instantly.
Oh, Lizzie. I'm so sorry.
I don't really cry. And my friends, we have attended a lot of, press conferences, spoke at, a lot of different places, hearings, City Hall. But I never shed a tear. But as years are going by, I feel like time doesn't really heal your pain. They say that time heals everything. No, it doesn't. And more and more, I'm getting emotional and becoming a crybaby. I cry, sorry. I try not to. All I knew is I had to get in touch with all the lawmakers. I kept writing emails to a lot of people. I mean, Mayor Bloomberg was in power at that time. And then council members, assembly members, congressmen, borough president, transportation secretary. I wrote to all of them.
It wasn't until New York City got a new mayor that things started to move. Bill de Blasio was elected in 2014, and he made traffic safety a priority. He adopted an international approach called Vision Zero, which aims for zero traffic fatalities. And it's based on the idea that traffic deaths are not inevitable, and they're not even accidental. They're the result of poor street design. So New York City's Vision Zero plan included lower speed limits, more enforcement, and stiffer penalties for traffic violations. Failing to yield to a pedestrian became a punishable crime, for example, if the pedestrian was injured or killed. The city also redesigned dozens of roads and intersections with speed bumps, bike lanes, and buffer zones between pedestrians and vehicles. On Queens Boulevard, where Asif Rahman was killed, the city installed a bike lane next to the curb, protected from traffic by a lane for parked cars.
I'm really happy, and after the work was done, we had a victory ride.
Now, since Lizzie Rahman is not a bike rider, she hitched a ride on a pedicab for that celebration.
And I was sitting with a picture of Asif next to me. I mean, I was sad at that time. I was also crying. If Asif were alive, he would be feeling happy and safe. But he wasn't there, and that's what made me sad. And I felt like this bike lane on Queens Boulevard, the whole thing was based on Asif's blood and my tears. And wouldn't it be nicer if the streets were safer when he was alive? But, I'm sure that he was watching from heaven, and he is happy that a lot of people are safe because of his sacrifice.
Lizzie Rahman is a founding member of the nonprofit advocacy group Families for Safer Streets. More than 50 cities across the U.S. have now followed in New York City's footsteps, adopting the Vision Zero framework for road safety. The worst of the problem is not in the big East and West Coast cities that you might expect.
If you look at the places that are most dangerous for pedestrians, it's primarily Sunbelt cities. So usually they'll do a top 10 list of the most dangerous metro areas, and a lot of times almost 8 will be in Florida.
Next on top of mind, the surprising history driving traffic fatalities in America. I'm Julie Rose. We'll be right back. Okay, top of mind listeners, before we get right back to today's episode, I would like to introduce you to another gem of a show from the BYU Radio family of podcasts. It's In Good Faith. It's hosted by Stephen Cap Perry. And on each episode, he interviews members of different religions and spiritualities to better understand their relationship with the divine. Whether you wish to strengthen your own relationship or just listen to thoughtful conversations about religion, dive into an enriching world of spiritual exploration with Stephen Cat Perry on In Good Faith. Listen anywhere you get podcasts. Our roads weren't always so dangerous.
In the United States, we used to kind of be able to just expect or count on traffic deaths to improve over time. That was sort of the pattern, more or less, since the 1970s.
This is Angie Schmidt. She has been reporting on traffic fatalities and road design for years. And she wrote a book a few years back called Right of Way: Race, Class, and the Silent Epidemic of Pedestrian Deaths in America.
You know, in the 1970s, we weren't requiring seatbelts. Ralph Nader came out with unsafe at any speed. And that was when we first started regulating vehicles a little bit for safety. So over time, the expectation is that this problem is going to get better. But compared to other developed nations, our progress was stalling.
Global safety trends, things like seatbelts and airbags and drunk driving laws, made a difference. Countries across the world saw big decreases in traffic deaths coming into the 21st century. And most have seen that progress continue, but not us.
We have about twice the number of people getting killed in the United States on a per capita basis than like Canada, you know, our neighbor to the north. And it's gotten worse since the pandemic. We've seen a real increase in reckless driving, and we were having about 6,500 pedestrian deaths a year. Now it's up almost 20%. It's more like 7,500, which is surprising and alarming.
I mean, are we just terrible drivers? What's going on in the United States then that we wouldn't have, that all of those safety efforts, you know, airbags and seatbelts and, you know, speed limits wouldn't have actually made the kind of improvements that we saw in other countries?
We do drive a lot in the United States, that has to be said, compared to like a Norway. We do drive more miles in the United States. We have a higher car ownership rate.
We're bigger as well, so there's more ground to cover.
Maybe we're more suburbanized too than like Canada, because Canada is sparsely populated in a lot of areas too. But part of the problem is we're very permissive. Our rules about drunk driving are pretty lax. 0.08% is quite a bit past intoxicated. Different things like even allowing localities to be able to set their speed limits. In the United States, we generally don't allow that. It's regulated at the state level. So those kind of things have an impact.
So where are these accidents most likely to occur? What is this scenario in which someone in the United States is where the chances of a fatality involving a vehicle are most likely to happen?
So the most dangerous kind of streets we call suburban arterial roads. And those are, you know, I think like the best example is sort of like the kind of streets that have a Walmart, you know, those commercial streets that have maybe fast food restaurants are often pretty dangerous. And it's especially sort of dangerous if there is maybe lower income housing in the mix and retail establishments that people might want to access on foot, and really not much in the way of safety infrastructure for those folks. Sometimes these streets don't even have sidewalks. That's a big risk factor. They might not have adequate lighting. That can be a big risk factor because a disproportionate share of pedestrians are killed at night. A lot of these roads are especially dangerous if they have a bus route. So if there's a bus route, people are getting on and off, but there's not sort of reasonable accommodations for those folks. That can put people in a dangerous position.
So people are like darting, are they not using crosswalks? Are they not like waiting for the light? What is it specifically? Is it the pedestrian behavior that is especially making this risky on these streets?
So that's sort of the impulse, is to kind of blame the people walking. I think that's a big mistake. I was looking at this case recently where an 82-year-old woman was struck, and for her to have used a crosswalk, she would have had to make a half-mile detour, which is just sort of unreasonable to ask an 82-year-old person to do. I mean, that could be a 15-minute sort of delay. So the average pedestrian just won't sort of comply with that. It's not rational. But we haven't done a very good job sort of anticipating pedestrians' needs and planning with their needs in mind on our roads. So, and even if pedestrians do use crosswalks, that's not necessarily safe. I'm a big cyclist and pedestrian, and I can't tell you. I mean, I actually was struck. It was a minor thing, but I was struck by a car. It was a hit and run crash, and I was in the crosswalk with the walk signal, and the guy had a green light, and I don't think he realized, it was his responsibility legally to yield to me when he was turning. I don't think drivers really even understand the rules.
Are there certain kinds of cities? Is this mostly a big city problem, or what's the pattern there?
There's a group called Smart Growth America, Transportation for America. They do a report every 2 years that highlights some of the most dangerous places, and it's primarily Sunbelt cities. And when I go around talking about this, I do try to explain sort of the history there and why that is. And a lot of people think it's because they're warm and people walk more, but that's really not true.
It's actually because southeastern cities didn't start booming until air conditioning was invented in the mid-1900s.
So almost all their development was at that sort of the height of the auto era, and they're left with this legacy of really wide roads that tend to be pretty dangerous, and the way they're developed is very car-centric and hostile to walking.
By comparison, says Schmidt, big northern cities like Boston, New York, and Cleveland, where she's from, sprang up several decades earlier.
Our heyday was almost kind of closer to the turn of the century. That was prior to the auto era in the United States. When I do my presentations, a lot of times I use these before and after images of a couple roads in Cleveland. And so Cleveland developed sort of around a streetcar system, and they had a lot of the roads weren't super wide. I use a photo from 1908, and downtown, our sidewalks are just teeming with pedestrians. And at the time, there weren't even any crosswalks. Pedestrians had free right to cross wherever they wanted. They could pause. People look really relaxed, sort of crossing the street back there. They could sort of pause and talk to someone. The merchants would sell goods from streets. So people who lived in cities at that time, they really didn't need cars to get around. Everything was a little bit closer together. There was these very efficient streetcar systems. After 1940, there was this big shift in the way we designed roads and in the way we designed our neighborhoods that was much more car-centric. And we sort of reorganized our built environment around cars, where people are almost always getting a free parking spot wherever they go. But the downside is, if you want to walk somewhere, now we've taken it to such an extreme that a lot of people can't access any destinations by walking, can't make safe trips, safe short trips, even recreational walking trips by their house. There might not be facilities for that. Children, it's especially, I think, sort of devastating for children. Anymore, you hardly even see children biking. Outdoor play has really declined compared to that, early urban pre-auto industry era. So, our whole society was transformed.
And there was an immediate impact on safety.
The introduction of cars resulted in a lot of traffic deaths. Immediately, thousands of people sort of were getting killed, especially after the introduction of the Model T Ford that sort of helped popularize or normalize car ownership. So there was this kind of counter movement that was led primarily by mothers who had lost their children in car crashes. And they sort of tried to push back and mobilize and impose some restraints on driving in cities. And basically as we all know, they basically failed for the most part. And the highway engineer and auto sales and gas sellers sort of, they organized an opposition and were able to institute most of the changes they promoted, including this idea of jaywalking that shifted blame when someone who was walking or played in the street was hit and killed, shifted blame from the driver to the person who was struck.
Now, restricting where pedestrians could and couldn't be meant the streets were, legally speaking, car territory. But the move did make a dent in traffic deaths, which dropped in response. And they dropped again in the 60s and 70s with regulations like airbags and seatbelts. And then again in the 80s as laws began to pass requiring seatbelt wearing. But something changed in 2009.
And all of a sudden, those kind of deaths are increasing.
Angie Schmidt thinks it could be because we're driving different kinds of vehicles now.
Cars have gotten bigger. So it used to be kind of like a Honda Civic. I mean, it's a little bit of a small car, but that was more like the typical car on the road right now. And there's been this big shift to SUVs, basically. Now, maybe a RAV4 or the bigger version, like a Toyota 4Runner, is more like the normative car now. So those cars are A, heavier, but B, they have these higher, blunter front ends. That's very trendy now. So not only are they hitting people with this really like blunt force, really high on the body, but also they have, in some cases, really large forward blind zones at close range, and they run the risk of knocking people under the wheels of the vehicle when they strike them.
Yeah. So cars get bigger and heavier, and more of those types on the roads in the United States around this time that we start seeing more of these vulnerable pedestrian, cyclist, motorcyclist deaths on our roads. Also around that same time, so 2009 was just a few years after the iPhone came out, smartphones become basically ubiquitous in the coming years. And we all know that distracted driving is a thing, right? So do you also think, does it seem pretty clear then that that's another driver in terms of why drivers are, maybe not seeing or more likely to strike a pedestrian?
Yeah, almost certainly that is a factor. Although it's kind of hard to say. We haven't been able to study it with like the same kind of precision as some of these other factors, because after a crash, people don't volunteer that information that they were distracted. And we haven't done a very good job of sort of formalizing, documenting that if someone is struck. But a lot of other countries, a lot of other developed countries haven't seen the same kind of increase. So it doesn't seem to be just universal to the adoption of smartphones. It could be that the Canadas, Australias, UKs aren't quite as wired into that as we are in the United States, but we haven't seen sort of the same kind of trend in other wealthy developed nations that do have pretty high cell phone penetration.
These days, Angie Schmidt runs a consulting firm where she encourages cities to focus on road design for better safety. And the techniques are often easier and less expensive than you might think.
The countries that have the best road safety records, they understand that drivers make mistakes, pedestrians make mistakes, but that just because you make a mistake on the road doesn't mean you deserve to die, right? So we want to design our systems to be forgiving so that nobody is killed or seriously injured, even if a mistake or misbehavior like that happens. There's a Canadian traffic safety expert that's helped inspire some of my work a little bit. And he says you need to separate pedestrians by time and space. So with space, a lot of roads in the United States don't have sidewalks at all. That's really important. If a road doesn't have a sidewalk, that's a big safety problem. So that's giving people a little bit of space. And it's even better if the sidewalk is separated from the street a little bit. And it's even better if there's trees in between that and the road. That's more separation, more protection. But also, he says time. So we can retime traffic signals, for example. We could give pedestrians dedicated phases. If you have an intersection where you have a good number of pedestrians, it's a smart idea to introduce something called a leading pedestrian interval. And that means that they just get a few seconds head start. So before the light turns green to go in the other directions, pedestrians are 3 seconds ahead in the middle of the crosswalk where they're really visible. And that has been shown to improve safety. So there's a lot of little tricks like that, and they're not always very expensive.
What else can be done to increase visibility, pedestrian visibility?
So street lighting is huge. You can redesign intersections a little bit. There's a good example that everyone in my industry really loves, Hoboken, New York, who hasn't had a traffic death in a number of years. It's a very densely populated city right outside New York City. And one of their key tools that they use is called intersection daylighting. And basically they don't allow cars to park close to the intersection. That's usually a standard practice in all of our cities. If there's a stop sign, you're not allowed to park right next to it, right? You're supposed to be whatever the standard is. Usually it's like 20, 25 feet. But a lot of people break those rules, especially in a place like Hoboken. And if they do, well, then the whole intersection becomes kind of a blind zone. And a pedestrian who's crossing the crosswalk is having to stick their neck out past the parked car and no one can see them. So that creates a visibility problem. And they've had a lot of success with this tool they call daylighting, and they may just put some bollards down that widen sort of that crossing area and prevent cars from parking there. And that really improves visibility for both parties. And that they've been really successful with that also.
Does improving safety for pedestrians and cyclists, though, always mean that there's going to be less space for cars? It's always a choice that we have to make between you're either going to have less parking and fewer lanes and maybe a little bit more congestion, which makes people angry, and you're going to have safer pedestrians, or you're going to have pedestrians at risk, but the cars are going to be able to flow.
So sometimes there's trade-offs, but sometimes there isn't. And I think those kind of conflict scenarios are a little bit sexier for our news media. And, we're kind of in the United States in this moment where I feel like we're kind of really into fighting and conflict. So that takes up a lot of the oxygen. But I don't think a lot of people would oppose improving street lighting, which is something that could be really effective, or adding real bus shelters so people aren't kind of waiting across the street and then running over, or just adding, sometimes people oppose sidewalks and get angry about sidewalks or curb ramps, but those kind of things can really help and don't involve sort of removing right-of-way for cars.
Angie Schmidt is a writer, consultant, and author of Right-of-Way, Race, Class, and the Silent Epidemic of Pedestrian Deaths in America. Many cities have taken bigger steps in addressing street safety, actually eliminating lanes, for example, like we heard about on Queens Boulevard in New York. These bigger redesigns are called road diets, and they tend to be particularly controversial. Take West Roxbury, which is a neighborhood in Boston.
We have a main street, Center Street in West Roxbury, which is about a mile long.
Steve Morris lives in West Roxbury and runs a real estate company there.
I also raised my 3 kids here and now helping to raise my grandchildren here. My office looks over Center Street. There's a bar, restaurant, there's a bakery, so there's a lot of back and forth traffic across. There's foot traffic. We have a YMCA that caters to a lot of children, a lot of after-school programs. We have 3 schools on Center Street. We have 3 funeral homes. So it's a very dynamic street.
And Center Street also has a history of pedestrian accidents. Most recently, in 2019, 66-year-old Marilyn Wentworth was struck and killed by a car while in a crosswalk.
And the sad story is that she had stepped out of her car and was waiting for her senior husband to come around the car, and they're going to cross the street. But it was winter glare. A woman came and hit her, never applied the brakes, and killed her. And at that time, then Mayor Walsh had dropped kind of a test to see what the community felt about a road diet. He had proposed removing 2 of the travel lanes, 1 in each direction, and then putting in a bike lane. And there was immediate reaction against it.
Morris and about 15 other residents formed the West Roxbury Safety Association.
We were opposed to it because we just saw congestion, and there's just not much bike usage in Boston. Anecdotally, if I see 6 bicycles a day, that's a lot.
What's the harm, though? I mean, if it accomplishes less fatalities, safer for pedestrians, what harm is done by implementing the road diet?
West Roxbury is a residential neighborhood, a lot of cut-through streets. There's 16 streets or so off of Center Street. We were also concerned with safety in the neighborhood. And, I currently have 3 grandchildren, expecting a 4th very soon. So they're over our house all the time. And I'm concerned for them. And that's what there were a lot of parents who were concerned about. Well, geez, if you got 15,600 cars, they're not going to wait in traffic. So the negative is that if there was an unreasonable danger condition or lack of safety thing, it was just transferring it to the residential neighborhoods. So you can control it on a main street. You can't control it on side streets. And that's where the kids are. The kids are not down on Center Street unescorted, but they're most likely, there's a good chance they could be in front of their house unescorted.
Some of the businesses on Center Street were also worried about the potential loss of customers because of increased congestion and limited parking. So Morris and the West Roxbury Safety Association proposed a different set of interventions to make the street safer.
And what we did is said, we just can't be the negative. This is bad, we don't want it, change is no good, don't do that. And we said, we need to offer our own alternative solution. So the community, our community is roughly 28% senior citizens. There were concerns about crossing signals not being long enough. There was one intersection in particular that was the danger intersection, and that was very close to where this woman was killed. And we had said right along, put a traffic light there. It's almost in the dead center geographically of the Center Street area. But as we were doing our audit, we started looking at nighttime, and some of these intersections were very dark. The overhead street lights weren't bright enough, so that was a concern. So we felt, if I did an analogy to a dentist's office, the street needed a filling, not every tooth ripped out and new false teeth put in. We actually asked for more police presence. And the police really weren't monitoring Center Street. And I'm not knocking them. They've got other things to deal with. We knew that there was a manpower shortage. We had recommended park an empty vehicle. They did in Rosendale Square. They do that. They park an empty police vehicle at different intersections. They move it around, and then they go back to wherever they're doing. But it's a bright blue beacon, and people see it and say, "Oh, what's my speed?" So, we really felt we had addressed all parties on it.
Now, the city did not adopt the West Roxbury Association's plan, but in the face of community backlash, the city didn't move forward with its plan either. Then a new mayor, Michelle Wu, was elected in 2021, and she revived the original road diet for Center Street and pushed it through. Construction finished in December of 2023. Center Street went from 2 travel lanes each way to just 1, with an emergency vehicle lane in the center and new bike lanes along the curbs. Parking spots sit between the bike and the travel lanes to separate cyclists from traffic. Now, it's too early to know if the changes will reduce pedestrian and bike injuries or fatalities. But Steve Morris says Center Street is definitely a lot more congested.
I just did a 2-block stretch twice in the last month and timed my 2 blocks. Used to take me, I'm guessing 30 seconds. I never timed myself before. It took me 4 minutes and 5 minutes to go 2 blocks. That's ridiculous. So you've got now cars sitting there spewing, fumes into the atmosphere, noise that aren't moving. So I'm not an environmental engineer, but I'm thinking that if it took me 5 minutes to go 2 blocks, whatever, it took me 30 seconds before, that I'm somehow polluting more. And the road this abomination that they've installed here is, in my mind, spewing a lot more pollutants into the atmosphere.
He's also not convinced the few cyclists he sees using the new bike lanes are any safer.
There's going to be some bicyclists who are going to get doored, if that's a word.
From the parking
a passenger
lane.
opening a door. It's going to happen. And nowadays, these bike lanes, they're not just for bicycles, they're for motorized bikes. That can do a lot of damage to a senior crossing. And if you have parked cars now, a parked van, and right there with it's roughly, I'd say, a 2-foot buffer and then a 2-foot bike lane. That's what they create. I don't even know how they did this. But anyway, it's creating more blind spots than ever before.
Steve Morris is a founder of the West Roxbury Safety Association. So have you noticed any of these safety designs popping up in your city? I've actually seen a bunch of them, and I have not known what they're for until now. Some mysterious bollard pops up at an intersection, or a lane gets reconfigured, and I'm thinking, what is the point of this? Now I'm realizing they are the very tweaks we've been hearing about to make pedestrians a little more visible, or often to send a subtle signal to me as the driver to slow down a bit. But do we really need to be changing roads when cars these days are basically supercomputers on wheels? Some can even drive themselves, so couldn't technology inside the car be a more effective solution?
The savings in lives, the savings in injuries is so dramatic that no other technology, I don't think, can get us there. What are we waiting for?
I'm Julie Rose. That's next on Top of Mind. We'll be right back to today's episode of Top of Mind. But first, are you ready to immerse yourself in the awe-inspiring world of nature? Then I recommend you listen to Constant Wonder. It's another great show from the BYU Radio family of podcasts. Join host Marcus Smith in riveting conversations with individuals whose lives have been touched by Earth's beauty and mysteries. Uncover captivating stories that shed light on our planet's wonders, from history to science and beyond. If you crave enriching experiences and a deeper connection with the world around you, tune in to Constant Wonder. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
For some reason or other, I really got interested in cars at a very young age. I was probably 10 or 12, and I mean really into it.
John McElroy is a journalist, commentator, and president of the network Autoline, where he covers all the latest tech advancements in the auto industry. A lifelong obsession with cars has not stopped him from having safety concerns of his own, though.
Look, I think everybody's had a close call in some way, shape, or form. Everybody. I have been hit on a bicycle, thank goodness, at very low speed. Kid turned abruptly in front of me with a car. I went down in a heap. Thank goodness he stopped to make sure that I was okay. And I've been in various car accidents, anything from fender benders to some fairly serious collisions, and but nary a scratch on me.
So what goes through your mind when you see these sort of recurring headlines from these reports that come out saying that traffic fatalities are increasing in the United States, that we have higher rates than in other countries, and that in particular pedestrians and cyclists are at real risk in the United States?
Yeah, look, it's a huge issue, and it's been ever since the automobile came out. But now there's so many of them on the road. There's roughly 40,000 motor vehicle traffic fatalities every year. Another stat that a lot of people don't know is roughly 2 to 2.5 million people are injured badly enough in a car accident. So, imagine if we could save 40,000 lives, or even a huge chunk of that. Imagine if we did not have to send over 2 million people to the hospital every year. What would be the impact on the cost of the American healthcare system? I think it would be dramatic. One of my big things that I've been pushing for years is this technology that they call V2V, vehicle to vehicle. But it allows cars to communicate to each other so that, we can almost make it literally impossible for them to crash into each other.
Describe for me when you first witnessed the power of this technology.
Yeah, this is a great story. So this goes back to, I'm not sure exactly the year, but it's around 2004. And I was invited to a demonstration that General Motors had put together. And we went out to this test area. It was this huge paved area. And way out in the distance, there was a car parked on the pavement. And I got into a Cadillac CTS with an engineer, a GM engineer. And he pointed out way down on this big open area, and he says, "See that car way down there?" He says, "I want you to start this one up, and I want you to try to drive right into it." So I put on the seatbelt, started the engine, got going, and he's like, "Come on, get going. Get it up to at least 50 or 60 miles an hour." And he said, "And keep aiming at that car." So after, a few seconds, a light started flashing on the dashboard, and a beep, 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 beep went along with the flashing light. And I said to the engineer, "What's that about?" He says, "That's to get your attention to look ahead and see that there's a vehicle in your pathway. Don't try to avoid it. Keep your foot on the gas. Don't lift."
What's going through your mind? What's going through your mind at that point?
Well, look, I'm not scared. I figure, if it looks like all bets are off, I'll make an emergency maneuver at the last second. But I was rather enjoying this because I kind of knew what was coming. But anyway, as I'm going 50 to 60 miles an hour, the front seat starts vibrating, right under my thighs, brrr, like that. And I said, "What's that about?" He says, "That's to really warn you that your collision is almost imminent here, but don't lift, don't steer." So I kept my foot on the gas, and sweet as you please, the car I was in started slowing down and came to a nice stop a foot or two away from the other Cadillac that they had parked out there. And that was an example of V2V communication. in which each car is equipped with the technology that broadcasts in a very small footprint, about 300 yards. And the signal coming out of the car says, I am a car, and I'm traveling in this direction. I'm going at that speed. I've gone from here to there in the last 300 yards. My likely path in the next 300 yards is this. And it's completely anonymous information. There's nothing about you, nothing about the VIN of the car. It's just, I am this object traveling at this speed in this direction. And other cars pick that up, and one might say, oh my gosh, we're going to occupy the same space at the same time if we don't do something about it. And so in the early demo that I had, the driver was warned, you should slow down or whatever. But today, the technology's advanced enough that we could do automatic braking, automatic acceleration, or even automatic steering. And so we could make it impossible for cars to crash into each other. And let me give you a few other examples. Somebody runs a red light, and you're driving along, and your vision is blocked. You don't even know that they're running the red light. Instead of getting T-boned, your car would hit the brakes, let this car sail right through, and there's no accident.
Hopefully the person behind me also has it so that they wouldn't rear-end me.
Exactly. No, that's another great example. What if, 3 cars are going down the road and the front car slams on its brakes? The third car doesn't see that. But with V2V, it automatically starts braking because it knows that 2 cars in front, somebody has slammed on the brakes. Same thing with blind spot detection. A lot of cars have that today. You see a little light in your mirror that indicates, hey, somebody's off to your blind spot on the right-hand side of the car or the left-hand side of the car. But cars use ultrasonic sensors for that, usually one on each side, maybe even one in the rear. With V2V, you could get rid of all those sensors. Same goes for automatic emergency braking, looking ahead, at least for other vehicles or motorists or bicyclists with a cell phone. It automatically starts braking. And, some of these sensors, if there's slush on them, they get dirty, they don't work as well. This is all wireless technology. It doesn't matter what the weather is. It doesn't matter if it's pitch black outside at night. It doesn't even know that.
Now, McElroy first saw V2V technology in action in 2004. It's been 20 years, and it is still not in cars.
When I asked the GM engineers, when do you think this could be in production? They said, maybe around 2012. And I'll get into some of the details now of why that never happened. But it was first based on part of the Wi-Fi protocol. And a big battle was fought in Congress and outside of Congress over it because the auto industry wanted part of that spectrum. And the telecommunication companies also wanted that spectrum. And there was a big fight, and the automakers won it. They got part of that spectrum carved out for them, but then they didn't do anything with it. And, in GM's case, it went bankrupt in 2009. That delayed everything at the company. And GM was the strongest proponent of this. In fact, it even started putting in, I can't remember what the year was, 2015, 2016. It started putting V2V technology in Cadillacs, but nobody else was doing it. And then it sort of went away. There was actually a rule written, I think it was by NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, during the Trump administration, but the Trump administration just let it die. And I'm not trying to pick on Trump here because the Democrats haven't done anything with this either. But,
because of cost or because of regulation? I mean, why wouldn't the car companies just do it themselves?
Because there was no mandate. And they don't like doing things that is going to increase, even though this cost is very, very minimal. You're probably looking at maybe $100 a car, far cheaper than putting airbags in cars, far, far cheaper than that, or any of the other safety technology, except maybe seat belts. But because there was no mandate, none of the automakers wanted to put it in.
Tell me a little more about why the car companies wouldn't do it themselves if it could save the lives of their drivers. I mean, do car companies not have an incentive to pull out all the stops?
Yeah, sure they do. But, sometime in around 2015, 16, something like that, maybe it was 2017, I don't remember exactly, Cadillac started putting it in some of its cars. But Cadillac, I don't know what their market share is. It's a couple of percentage points. Unless everybody has this in their vehicles, it's simply not going to reach its full potential. You can't have 1 out of 10 cars with this technology and expect to see a dramatic reduction in fatalities and injuries. But if 40,000 people are getting killed right now a year, boy, I would think that before 2040, if it was mandated now, we could save easily 30,000 of those lives a year.
And even though older cars wouldn't have this technology, John McElroy says that a mandate beginning in 2024, for example, would help V2V become more and more effective over time.
Let's say that GM was right and it was ready to go into production in 2012. Right now, today, let me make a quick, there would be close to 200 million vehicles in the United States with all this technology. We've got about 250 to 280 million vehicles, so we'd almost be all the way there. So I don't think we should be wasting any time at all. NHTSA should get on the stick and start writing a regulation and mandating this. And yeah, it's going to take 10, 15, 20 years before every single vehicle on the road has it, but the savings in lives, the savings in injuries is so dramatic that no other technology, I don't think, can get us there. What are we waiting for?
And how could it work to help pedestrians and cyclists? So what would the technology be then that would allow, your car to recognize that the kid is going to make a leap in front of you?
This could also include cell phones, so that pedestrians and bicyclists, at least with their cell phone with them, could be communicating with cars completely anonymously, all in the background. You never even know what's going on, and literally make it impossible for a car to crash into them. So if you're a pedestrian with a cell phone or a bicyclist or whatever, the vehicles would be able to recognize, whoops, somebody's stepping out in front of between these two cars, hit the brakes right now. It would probably start as an app, but I could even see it becoming a mandate that all cell phones have this technology.
Yeah.
With the proper political pressure to make sure that gets enacted.
Yeah. Yeah, of course, I could see people worried then about, are you tracking my location? Do the car manufacturers now have this information?
Julie,
I could see privacy issues.
Anybody with a cell phone in their pocket that's worried about themselves getting tracked is delusional. That horse bolted out of the barn with the first cell phone.
And I would imagine you would probably have a similar argument when it comes to the privacy questions around just vehicle location information. If everybody's got GPS and OnStar and whatever in their cars these days, it seems like that's pretty trackable too.
Right. And that's why from the very get-go with this V2V technology, even, in 2004, they recognized this has to be completely anonymous or people are not going to trust it. And so all it does is, like I said, it beams out a signal saying, I'm a vehicle traveling in this direction at this speed. And, or my steering wheel's turning or my brakes are being applied. But that's it. It's there's no other personal information or vehicle information other than that.
Is there anything else you would recommend, though, that I could be thinking about as a vehicle consumer and as a driver, certain technology that I should be asking for when I'm buying a vehicle, things that I should be looking for to improve my chances of not having a dangerous crash or injuring someone else seriously?
Most new cars today, not all of them, but most of them come standard with quite a good array of safety equipment. So there's one called blind spot detection that we talked about. If a car on your left or your right is in your blind spot, usually a light lights up on the mirror of your car to warn you, hey, there's something there, look more closely. There's automated emergency braking, so that if a person, a dog, a bicycle, or another vehicle is in front of your car, it'll automatically slam on the brakes so that you don't hit it. I think a next step, though, what we need are infrared cameras, or what they call thermal cameras, because a lot of these cameras work brilliantly well during the sunshine, but they don't work very well at night. And in foggy or rainy conditions, even less so. There's a lot of interesting development, mostly coming out of the military, in fact, in that regard. And it's just a matter of getting the size and the cost of these things down so that you can put them in cars affordably. But it's coming.
You see car makers doing that, automakers doing that without a regulatory mandate?
Some will. So, look, this stuff is not cheap. So all new technology almost always starts in the luxury segment. The top line luxury cars, if you add, I'll just make up some numbers here, $1,000 in cost to a car that costs $150,000, whatever. But if it's a $25,000 car and you add $1,000 cost, yikes, that's a lot of cost. So it's going to start at the higher end of things and work its way down from there, as all technology in cars always has.
John McElroy, what do you think about self-driving cars or semi-automated cars having the ability to, part of the original promise was that would take the human error, the human distraction, the visibility issues out of the equation and potentially make for fewer fatalities and pedestrian encounters, that kind of a thing.
Autonomous cars, they're bristling with sensors. They typically have, what they call LiDAR, which is a light sensing kind of a radar. Then they have radar. Then they have cameras. And in many cases, they also have ultrasonic sensors, too. So, and they're processing all this stuff at, almost real time. It is real time. So, yeah, the potential is absolutely there. Autonomous cars will never get drunk. They'll never get tired. They don't take unnecessary risks. They're not, charged up with testosterone and trying to prove something to somebody. They don't have road rage. The promise for autonomous vehicles is enormous.
The big push, maybe partly because it's something that cities and governments can control, has been to redesign roads, to give pedestrians a head start in crossing streets and to create protected bike lanes. Do you think that we could solve this problem with technology and not have to redesign streets?
They go hand in hand. Traffic calming, as you know, is what you just described. It absolutely works. There's no question that it works. And we've pretty much built the road transportation system in this country for the benefit of cars, trucks, and buses, not for pedestrians. And now we're realizing, the pendulum went too far. We got to swing it back. And so a combination of traffic calming with some of the technology that we've been talking about is the path forward to reducing all these fatalities and all these injuries where people end up in hospitals.
John McElroy, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Julie. Great questions.
John McElroy is a journalist, car enthusiast, and prominent auto commentator. He's president of Blue Sky Productions and creator of Autoline. It's been great having you with us today for Top of Mind. If there's somebody you know who would find this episode helpful or thought-provoking, please share it with them. Word of mouth is the #1 way people discover new podcasts, so we would love your help with that. And we're eager to hear your thoughts about the show, too. What are you enjoying? What are we missing? What do you want to hear more of? Our email address is topofmind@byu.edu. Or you can reach us on social media. We are at topofmindpod on all the apps. Top of Mind is a BYU radio podcast. Today's episode was produced by Vanessa Goodman, Elena Beck, and James Hoops, with help from Samuel Benson, Sam Payne, and me. Our audio engineer and sound design team includes Gabe Vargas, Brandon Lewis, Josh Fouts, and Trent Reimschussel. I'm Julie Rose. We'll talk soon.